Okay, let's get underway. We're all set to go. We're just waiting for the time. It's 9:40. So today we're going to end very last chapter of Leviticus. So if you turn to chapter 27, and then we'll be ready to move on into the book of Numbers. And I just last Sunday reminded you that Genesis, the word itself, means beginning. Exodus is a movement out of something. We get our word exit, of course, from the same root here. Leviticus comes from the first four letters, Levi. Levi was the ancestor of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. So that family became the priestly ones. And in Leviticus you have lots of the minutiae to you and me of how the religious cult, I noticed the rabbi even called it a cult, how it functioned before and after Solomon's temple. Numbers have to do with census that was taken where they counted everybody. And I didn't get around to writing Deuteronomy, but I told you that if you change the E and the U here, you could tell, quick reminder, duet would be the word then. And N-O-M-Y is the plural form of N-O-M-O-S, nomos, which is law. And so when the scriptures were translated into Greek from Hebrew, called the Septuagint, you remember, those who were doing the work said, well, really this is the law second time around. And in fact, Deuteronomy repeats much of what you have in Exodus, including the Ten Commandments, gets repeated. And we know that this was written long time later. Genesis, Exodus have large segments of both J writer and the E writer. And Deuteronomy doesn't get written until a couple hundred years after J and E were put down. Okay. But anyway, we'll get to that later. We'll talk about Deuteronomy later. Today we're going to end Leviticus and move right on into Numbers. And I've got several passages in Numbers that I think you might find of interest. Let's pray. God, we open this all-important book of yours and try to understand. We want very much to know those things that are forever true about you and about us, how you initiate right relationship with us, and how we may appropriately respond to your love and grace that reach out to us. We offer our prayer and best efforts in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, maybe it would be good for us at least to stop a moment and see if you have any questions about anything you heard the rabbi say in his four presentations. If there's anything I can help you about. Maggie had asked, the rabbi made one brief statement about you and I don't count the Ten Commandments like the Jews. And that's really the only difference we have with them. They number them slightly differently from the way we do. What they put into the first and second commandment, and that ours is a little bit longer. Theirs a little bit briefer. I mean, the words are the same. It's just a matter of where you put the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's really, to me, not of any great significance. It wasn't important enough to him to mention at least. But the Ten Commandments are the same for Jews as they are for Christians as they are for Jews. It's just a matter of how you number, whether you consider that first commandment 2 or 3 verses, or whether it's just one verse, and then 2 begins right there, or begins a little bit later. But it's only a matter of numbering, nothing more. Okay, you understood everything you had to say. Okay. Yes. The question was, I've made the statement that sometimes rabbis don't talk about grace, but he talked about grace. Okay, this is where you get down to the difference in different kinds of forms of Judaism. Rabbi Fitzerman of Congregation B'nai Emunah, which is conservative, that's a conservative synagogue, one time in our Jewish Christian Dialogue group several years ago, I was talking about grace, and Mark kindly but firmly said, now wait a second, that's your word. That's not our word. Grace is a Greek word. It's a New Testament word. It's not Hebrew Scripture word. And I said, well, wait a second now, Mark. What about Abraham and Sarah? I mean, here's an old couple who've tried forever to have a baby and without success, and now they're just sort of waiting for death to come, and God comes by and makes them mother and father of a new nation of people. Is that not unmerited favor? And his answer was, no, God knew they would do the right thing. All right, here's the difference. Rabbi Zimmerman is Reformed. Charles Sherman is Reformed. Since there aren't lots of rabbis in Tulsa, we have primarily the one synagogue, the one temple. The two rabbis do not usually serve on the same thing at the same time, so that they can cover as many different groups as possible. So while Mark was in our Jewish Christian Dialogue group for some years, Charles was not. And then when Mark said, I think I've done this as long as is a fair term for me, Charles said, okay, then I'll come on to the group. Well, Charles Sherman has no problem talking about grace, the same way Zimmerman has no problem talking about grace. In fact, down in Houston, one of the best-known, best-loved rabbis when we were in the city was Hyman Shachtel, Rabbi Hyman Shachtel. And the more conservative Jews in town called his temple Congregation Beth Jesus. They put him down. They put him down as being too conciliatory to Christians, that he went too far in some of their minds. So in Israel, you may not know, but in Israel, Reform Judaism is not even recognized officially by the government. So Charles Sherman, Sheldon Zimmerman, and others, Hyman Shachtel in his lifetime, just had no credibility with certain ones. I think they've given away too much to Christianity, if you would, that they are too close to us for some. But I love what Rabbi Zimmerman said. In Judaism, he said, I honor your temple or synagogue and you honor mine, but neither one of us would be seen in that one, So when you have the ultra-Orthodox, like the Hasidim, and I can't remember when he said what, because I heard him 6 different times, 7 actually. Gail and I had dinner with him on Friday night at the Sherman's house, just before he preached at the temple. And then I heard him Sunday morning, Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, but I also heard him answer questions Monday noon and Tuesday noon. So I can't always remember just which one he was saying, what he said at any specific time. But he was trying very hard to use a common language that both of us could understand, and that the word grace is an okay word in Reform Judaism. I thought it was also interesting that he pointed out that the Hasidim, and these are the ones with the black hats and the black coats and so on, the little boys with the curled, the forelocks of their hair, or teased, curled just in front of their ears. That's not biblical times. That came out of Poland just 300 years ago. Okay, so it's not long-standing in Judaism. It's not the way Abraham and Sarah would have been dressed, or anybody else in biblical times. That form of dress came out of Polish Jewry 300 years ago. It's not that old. Gail and I were in Switzerland doing 3 weeks in Switzerland, not last summer when we were back in part of Switzerland, but about 5 or 6 years before. And everywhere we went, from little Swiss village to little Swiss village, every time we started to get on a train or in a little bus, here was a group of Hasidic Jews. A mom and a papa and 5 or 6 kids. They're very prolific. And when I got back home, I said to Charles, I'd never seen so many Hasidic Jews, in all these different places, all over Switzerland. He said, you were seeing the same family over and over. I said, no, I wasn't seeing them. No, I wasn't. Those were different ones. But anyway, the Hasidim are not all that old, about 300 years. But they have Jews, within within Israel, they have Jews that are as conservative as the most conservative Christians you know. They have inerrancy of Scripture folk, even though Rabbi Zimmerman said Jews have never taken the Scriptures literally. And they didn't until the Hasidim came along about 300 years ago. And it was a revolt and reaction against the Age of Enlightenment, against the Renaissance, a feeling that they had to retrench against modernism, the same way you have Amish, and sometimes Mennonites with that same kind of mentality. Okay, Amish and Mennonites don't go back to the time of Jesus. You know, they're movements that came out of Germany and were a reaction against the Protestant Reformation and modernism, Enlightenment, Renaissance, and so on. Okay. Somebody else I thought had a hand up over here. No?
I had a hand up, but it was more in that question about how he views Jesus, because he does talk about him a lot. Does he see him just as a man, a prophet, a rabbi?
Yeah. The question is, how would Rabbi Zimmerman understand Jesus of Nazareth? And both he and Charles Sherman, I think, very clearly say he was an observant Jew. The Gospels are very clear about that. Jesus' mother and Joseph did everything according to the law. When he was born, he was circumcised on the 8th day. He was taken to the temple for the proper blessing of a child. Luke's Gospel says they took him back when he was 12 years old to Jerusalem to the temple, which would have been a bar mitzvah kind of experience in those days. So he was and over the Gospels say he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath, as was his custom. They point out when he healed and when he didn't heal, and that he was in debate with the folks about how one properly observes the Sabbath, but he was certainly familiar with it. So they would both say he was a really good Jew. But they would not, either of them, see him as any sort of embodiment of God himself. And I thought the rabbi was making it very clear in the 2 nights that he talked about Moses. He kept saying over and over, he was just a man. He was just a man. A very good man, but only a man. And though he wasn't drawing that contrast for you, he was making a point with you that the way they see Moses as the clearest revealer of God ever, they still understand Moses to have been a man who did know sin, where we claim Jesus was a man who didn't sin, who was without sin. Okay. Yes, Richard?
I find it interesting that Reform is not recognized in Israel, but they have a seminary there.
Yes. But it was the last of their seminaries to be built, actually. The question for you at the back was that Richard was saying that he found it unusual or strange that Reform Judaism is not officially acknowledged in Israel, yet there is a seminary there. And I was saying it's the last of the Reform seminaries to have been built. The original one here in this country was Hebrew Union in Cincinnati. And then from there, the one in New York, the one in Los Angeles, and now one in Jerusalem. And they're all under one administrator, and Rabbi Zimmerman was that administrator of all 4 of those schools for 5 years. Last November, when Rabbi Sherman and the Jewish community brought to Tulsa an outstanding scholar, they do this every year, one of the medical doctors, now deceased in that congregation, Dr. Lubin, and Dr. Lubin was one of the founding members of the Jewish Christian Dialogue group that I was a charter member more than 25 years ago. He's since died, but he was a founding member, so I got to know Dr. Lubin for a number of years there before his death. He was chair of the committee 34 years ago that offered Temple Israel to Charles Sherman. So Charles can hardly talk about Dr. Rubin without tearing up a little bit, because he opened the door for Charles and Nancy to come to Tulsa, and they've loved Tulsa. It's been a really good home for them. So Dr. Lubin was very special. Well, when they bring this outstanding scholar in a series similar to ours, they bring an outstanding scholar, but Dr. Lubin left the money to pay for this scholar to stay over another day and to teach Gentile Christians on Monday. After they've had the scholar Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we get to hear the scholar Monday. And Dr. Lubin provided enough for the scholar to have a hotel room for the night and to feed us free the next day. And not only teaches us in the morning and the afternoon, but feed us a very nice luncheon as well. And every year they mention that Dr. Lubin's generosity made that possible. What I was going to say, the point of that was, this past November, just 3 months ago or so, the scholar they brought was a young woman who is the dean of the seminary in Los Angeles. And she was terrific. She was really, really bright, capable, good teacher, very good teacher. Early 40s, I would guess, the way she talked about the ages of her children. But anyway, they bring these great scholars. And so we've heard scholars from, not one straight from Jerusalem, but we have had from New York, from Cincinnati, and from Los Angeles in that series. I've gone to them as long as they've been having them. I always circle that date on my calendar because they're always really, really good. But I think you would be surprised and maybe discouraged at how many Christian ministers avail themselves of the opportunity to show up that day. Out of all the Christian churches in total, we have 43 Methodist churches. And between First and Asbury and us and Christ and so on, all the associates, how many ministers do we Methodists have? Their total attendance will be 35. Only 35 Christians show up to hear what their scholar has to say. Something like that. But it certainly is good for those of us who do go. It's really wonderful. Anything else that the rabbi said that wasn't clear to you? Oh, sorry. Yes? Yes, that's correct. Anne's question was, did she understand him correctly to say that Christianity brought monogamy to Judaism? And yes, he's correct about that. Through all the biblical period, it was allowed for Jewish men to have multiple wives. And even when it talks about handmaids, maidens, and so on, there was a special covenanting service for even them. They were considered family. When Jacob fathered sons with 4 different women, favored wife, not favored wife, and 2 handmaidens, they all had a special relationship, and all the sons were treated as sons. Not treated as well as the 2, but treated as sons nonetheless, and all did inherit. In the promised land, they all did inherit. So he was right about that it was after Christianity and our influence from the Roman and Greek world that we convinced the Jews that really was better to have one man, one woman making lifetime covenant with each other. Yeah. So they've not practiced polygamy in nearly 2,000 years. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Question, did they have multiple wives because they needed to increase the number of Jews in the world? They probably would have rationalized it that way. That certainly was the case with Abraham. Sarah thought it not. Remember that in Judaism, particularly early Judaism, they did not have any idea about life after death. You had this one life and that was it. So your immortality, if you would, that's not a Greek word, it's a Hebrew, not a Hebrew word, it's a Greek word. Immortality, what lived after you, your children. And in those days, particularly sons. Sons kept the name, sons inherited the property. So it was important to have children. And when Abraham and Sarah were not having babies, and as he pointed out, and I pointed out to you, it was always blamed on the woman. We now know, of course, it wasn't the woman's fault that babies weren't being made any more than it was the man's fault. It could work either way in different cases. But the women were faulted for it nonetheless. So Sarah thought it was the big thing to do to let Abraham have a child through this handmaid Hagar, and he did that. And then, of course, he had another son with Sarah, Isaac, and had 2. So then, when Jacob This same kind of thing played out, if you recall. He wanted Rachel. His uncle gave him Leah first, and then later, working more time, he got Rachel as well. But when each of those women was not producing babies, they turned to their handmaid and said, "Here, make more babies for me with this woman." So it was part of it, of having more babies. And one of the problems in Judaism today is that in conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism, they're not reproducing themselves. The more and more educated women have become, the less part of their lives, the smaller part of their lives they're willing to spend in raising children. But that's true all over the country, all over the world, let's say. When you go to Europe, countries there now are begging people to make babies. We were in the Scandinavian countries a couple of years ago, and guide after guide there was telling tourists how much incentives they give now for any couple in Sweden, in Finland, in Denmark, and Norway. If they'll make a baby, they'll give the wife a year off or the husband a year off. Choose one or the other. You can have a maternity leave or paternity leave for up to a year and get paid if you'll just make a baby. In Italy, of course, where officially the Pope says no birth control. In fact, as Italian women have gotten more and more education, they're making fewer and fewer babies. And even Italy, being a predominantly Roman Catholic country, is not reproducing itself now. So the Jews are having trouble with that they are having fewer than 2 children per couple, average. Except for the Hasidim. They're making lots of babies. Yes. Yes, Richard? Yes, sir.
In Israel, the Hasidim are 25% of the population, but have 90% of the children.
Yes. Did you hear that? In Israel itself, Richard was saying that the Hasidim, the most conservative ones, represent about 25% of the population, but have 90% of the babies. There's something else that you need to know, if you don't, about Israeli politics, and that is that they have too many political parties. In this country we have 2 primary ones. 2. In Israel they have so many political parties that no one can get a majority. When they have an election, nobody can get a majority. So you probably would be surprised also to know that most people in Israel do not go to the synagogue on Friday night. The majority are not observant. The majority go play golf, they go to the beach, they picnic, they barbecue like Americans, like Western Europeans. You think it would be a really religious country. It's not a really religious country. You have this roughly 25% of the population that sort of wags the dog because they can't form a government without them. When no political party has a majority, then you got to deal with this little group over here. And if you give them enough concessions, they'll come in on your side. If another one gives them more concessions, they'll come in on their side. And so they end up with really weird, strange things that the majority of the people do not believe. For example, I've told you about the elevators. When we started going to Israel in 1983, our first time over there, we stayed in the Jerusalem Hilton when we were in Jerusalem itself. Very nice hotel. On Friday sundown till Saturday sundown, one elevator went up and down, stopping at every floor. You didn't have to push a button. It's going to stop at every floor going up. It's going to come right back down. It's going to go right back up. It's going to right so that these ultra-conservative folks don't even have to push an elevator button. Well, guess what? In the last election, they couldn't put together a majority without this little group asking for another pound of flesh. And what they wanted this time was every elevator in this country has to be set on automatic during the Sabbath. Every elevator in the country has to stop on every floor going up and every floor coming down. Absurd. And the majority of the people think it's absurd. But to form a government, they had to deal with that little conservative minority. So they sometimes get more than they should be able to get, more concessions in their country, because they become the swing vote so often. By the way, some of you keep asking me, am I going to go to Israel? And I keep promising you, I am. Just stay tuned, trying to figure out the very best date. But for those of you who've wanted to go all these years, we haven't been now in more than 12 years. It's easy for me to remember because on our very last trip is when my dad, I noticed coughing. And our Jason had just finished medical school. It was in 1997. And he was with us before he began his residency. Jason was with us, and after several days, my dad just said, well, my allergies have been a little bad. My dad was not an allergic person. And I said to Jason, privately, pay attention to your granddad. I'm worried about this cough. And so Jason told me, let's don't mess up the trip now. There's nothing we can do here. I said, okay. When we were landing in Tulsa, literally, Jason leaned over to his granddad and said, tomorrow, Granddad, tomorrow, get a chest x-ray. Turned out he had lung cancer. So I remember very well. 1997 is when we were there last. It's been 13 years since we were there now. So it's been a long time. Some of those times we were really afraid that it wasn't safe. Lots of people are coming and going again now, so I'm willing to give it a try, and I'll be in touch with you, and I'll tell you first when we have a date that we've decided upon. Anything else? I don't want to belabor this, but if you have questions, I don't want to leave them unanswered if I can answer them. All right, turn to Leviticus chapter 27. I wanted to just read one little passage here with you because people ask from time to time about the tithe and what the tithe means and where it comes from. And here in things priestly, to keep the temple going, and the temple in Jerusalem, of course, needed support. The Levitical family were not allowed to own property. This carried over sort of in the Methodist church, the church having a parsonage for pastors to live in. House doesn't belong to the pastor. Pastors can be moved back and forth, in and around, and they don't own property, so to speak. The Levites didn't own property. The other tribes were supposed to care for them so that they could give full attention to holy things, things of God. Here it is, chapter 27, verse 30. All tithes from the land, whether the seed from the ground or the fruit from the tree, are the Lord's. They are holy, that is, set apart to the Lord. If persons wish to redeem any of their tithes, they must add 1/5 to them. That is, if you bring an animal that's 1/10 of your flock, so to speak, and you would really like to have that bull, cow, ram, ewe back, well, it'll just cost you 20% more to get it back. All tithes of herd and flock, every 10th one that passes under the shepherd's staff, when they counted them, going in and out of the sheepfolds, you count them, every 10th one, bring it in. Let no one inquire whether it is good or bad, or make substitution for it. If one makes substitution for it, then both it and the substitute shall be set apart and cannot be redeemed. These are the commandments that Yahweh gave to Moses for the people of Israel on Mount Sinai. Okay, let me say one more little thing. He did something the other night that may have confused some of you from the way I've always drawn the maps here. If you noticed, the other night, he put Sinai down here. He put Sinai here. There is a real debate still among scholars where Sinai was. This area is generally called on maps the Sinai Desert. And there is a very famous monastery over here called St. Catherine's. I told you some months ago now about one of the most famous mosaics and paintings in the world for Christianity, one of the earliest ones of the Pantocrator, God Almighty, that you find in many Eastern Orthodox churches. When the Muslims overran Turkey, this one was taken out of the Cathedral of St. Sophia, which became a mosque after the Muslims took over, the Ottoman Turks you've all heard about. And that was taken from Turkey all the way down to the monastery of St. Catherine. And it's still there. One of our women was touring Israel just a few months ago and brought me back some postcards from St. Catherine's Monastery and the Pantocrator there. So there are many Christians for sure who think the Sinai was over here. Obviously, Rabbi Zimmerman thinks it was over here. And even when he told you that he had gone up the mountain where Moses died 6 times, he had to say, we think it's Mount Nebo. Okay. So, they didn't put signs on them. This is Sinai or Horeb and so on. But as he reads the scriptures, and this is not a huge deal to you and me, he thinks Moses and the people camped here for 38 years, he told you, in one place. They didn't move around. Waiting for that generation to die out who thought they couldn't go safely in. And then eventually we all agree that in time they ended up coming this way into Jericho, crossed the river and into Jericho. So whether they were here a longer time or here a longer time and then came, as he said, you place your money, you take a choice. All right, let's go on to Numbers. Turn to chapter 6, please. This is not one of those books that has a lot of great stories for you and me. It's a lot about a census, and we're not really interested in how many people in each of the 12 tribes and what their names may have been. So it's not terribly important to you and me, but I thought you might be interested in chapter 6 because one of the most famous judges in the book of Judges became one of the people described here in Numbers 6. And his name was Samson. Samson became one of the people described here in chapter 6. And when we get to the stories about the judges, you can remember where we read about that. So look what it says. The Lord, and again this translates. Oh, by the way, did you get the point the other night when the rabbi was telling you how Jehovah is a distortion of the divine name and how it occurred? Okay. What he was showing you is that in the name given to Moses at the burning bush, that Hebrew had no vowels at the time. It had consonants. And to make it unpronounceable, the Jews purposely wrote it as YHWH. Unpronounceable. But if they wanted to pronounce, even though that wasn't the name itself, it's called a tetragram, the 4 letters. The name itself was Eye Asher Eye. Eye Asher Eye. And he mentioned something the other night that I hadn't heard a rabbi say, maybe ever, but what my professor said was, and that is that the name is really a rather unusual form of the verb to be, and that I am may not be the best translation. The better translation may be I will be who I will be, or I am becoming who I am becoming. That's what I was taught. But I hadn't heard a rabbi say that till Zimmerman said it the other night. And then he said it. Okay, but the shortened form of the name, YHWH, a tetragram. And then he said, for those occasions when we felt we needed to have a name that we could use in worship, 3 little vowels were added. And those vowels, if you just pronounce the vowels themselves, became, in Hebrew, Adonai. Adonai. And the King James scholars, not knowing that, took the 4 consonants and the three vowels and came up with something Jehovah. Years ago, when I moderated a radio program in Houston, I'm sure you've heard me tell this story, but bear with me if you have. I was the young preaching associate with Dr. Charles Allen, First Methodist Church, and I got a call from the head of Goodwill Industries at that time in Houston. Head of Goodwill Industries there was a United Methodist minister. He had come to Houston from being head of Goodwill Industries in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Well, lo and behold, the big ABC radio station there in Houston was called KXYZ, And KXYZ ABC also had a big radio station in Pittsburgh. Houston was a bigger market than Pittsburgh, so the head of the radio station up in Pittsburgh got transferred to Houston. And back in Pittsburgh, this Methodist preacher who was working for Goodwill Industries had the head of that big radio station on his board, and they started a radio program, a late-night radio call-in show. Well, when both of them at different times ended up in Houston, this guy called the head of Goodwill Industries and asked him would he be willing to do a program like that in Houston. You give your time, station will give its time. He said, okay, he'd be willing to do that. So then he called me and said, would you be the first guest on? Since you are on television with Dr. Allen, a lot of people know your name. We could make some publicity out of this. You come on the first 2 Sunday nights with me and take calls. I said, okay. So I was scared to death. I'd never done this before. He had done this. So we answered calls those first 2 Sunday nights, hour and a half. I mean, you got nothing but a telephone there with all these little lights blinking, and you hope they keep blinking, so you have plenty to talk about. After 2 weeks of that, and when we first started, it was from 10:30 to midnight. And after 2 weeks, this guy said, I'm older than I used to be in Pittsburgh. I don't want to do this. And the station looked at me and said, you're the only one with any experience. How about if you take over? I had 2 weeks experience. So I took over the radio show, and I did it the next 7 years. It became popular enough that they moved us on up to 9:30 to 11. And that was an even bigger audience. But when we first got started, I could tell by the questions they asked, I was being harassed by Jehovah's Witnesses. And they wanted to talk about Christmas trees being idols that we bow down to, and quoting the scripture that the pagans cut down trees and decorate them and bow down to them. And even though I kept insisting we don't bow down to our Christmas trees, we're not worshiping our Christmas trees. And that was one of their things. And you're not supposed to give blood transfusions according to Jehovah's Witnesses, and you don't salute an American flag, and all sorts of things. And finally one night I said, you have not identified the group from which you come. You know who I am. You know where I work. So I'm about to tell everybody who you are. You are Jehovah's Witnesses. And you are going over the same things over and over. I'm going to quit taking your calls if you cannot come up with a different question. And furthermore, your insistence on literalism, let me tell you what real trouble you're in. Your tenet, the tenet of your faith says, if you are not called by my name, you are not my people, and you got the wrong name. They quit listening to me. At least quit calling me. I didn't have to fool with Jehovah's Witnesses the next 7 years. I was through with them. But when you become so literal, and then guess what? You have the wrong name. All right, let's go back here. Chapter 6. The I am who I am. The I am becoming who I am becoming. Spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when either men or women make a special vow, the vow of a Nazirite. Now, let me quickly tell you, this has nothing to do with Jesus' hometown. Nothing. It's not about Nazareth. In fact, I've told you before, in all 39 scrolls of the Hebrew Scriptures, Nazareth is never mentioned a single time. So this has nothing to do with Nazareth, even though the names seem similar. The vow of a Nazarite, to separate themselves to the Lord. Okay, not from the Lord. To separate themselves from the way other people are acting by sort of the nearest thing you and I would have today probably would be priests and nuns. Okay, sort of like priests and nuns. I don't mean they've taken all these same vows, but that kind of idea. Setting yourself apart for the Lord, to the Lord. Okay, but for Nazarites within Judaism it meant they shall separate themselves from wine and strong drink. Okay. They shall drink no wine vinegar, even bad wine, you see, or other vinegar, just in case. This week, one of our young men in our church was having to write a term paper at Cassia Hall on one of the 7 last words of Jesus. And the one he had drawn was, I thirst. And so he came in to see me after school one afternoon, and he and I dealt with I thirst. And I was helping him understand best I could that the Romans were not being cruel to Jesus when they lifted up to him vinegar or sour wine on a sponge. It's what they had. They didn't have the really wonderful aged stuff that they got to drink. They had the really cheap wine. But it was safer than drinking from most of the water wells. And so they had wine, a sour wine that they drank. They were not being cruel. They really offered up to him what they were drinking and put it on a sponge for him, as you recall. So I'm certainly not a connoisseur of wine. I don't know one from the other. Would have no appreciation between a $5 box of wine or whatever they call it and a $500 bottle. But I have been told that if wine ages too much and not properly, it turns to a vinegar. And I have had wine vinegar on salads and so on. So just to be sure that these Nazarites didn't fudge a little bit, you see, as to whether it was wine or not wine, no vinegar, not wine vinegar nor any other kind of vinegar for folks with as a Nazarite. And to be doubly sure, shall not drink any grape juice or eat grapes, fresh or dried. All their days as Nazarites, they shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. I mean, how strict is this group? All the days of their Nazarite vow, no razor shall come upon the head until the time is completed for which they separate themselves to the Lord. In other words, you don't have to do this your whole life. It might be like a time of fasting, sort of like Ramadan would be for Islamic men and so on. All right. Whatever the time frame is, during that time, no cutting the hair. They shall be holy, set apart. They shall let the locks of the head grow long. And of course, that's where Samson got in trouble. All the days that they separate themselves to the Lord, they shall not go near a corpse. Remember dead bodies? They didn't know often why a person had died. They didn't understand disease very well. They certainly knew nothing of bacteria or viruses. So dead folks were considered unclean, ceremonially, ritually unclean. Even if their father or mother, brother or sister should die, I mean, that close of family members, they may not defile themselves because their consecration to Elohim is upon the head. All their days as Nazarites, they are set apart to the Lord. Okay, let me change gears just a little bit and tell you that one of the ways that the temple here in Tulsa differs from the synagogue is that people who belong to the synagogue and die and want to be buried through the synagogue, their bodies are actually handled by members of the synagogue. They use Fitzgerald's funeral home right over here. I don't know just how that relationship got started, but virtually every Jew in Tulsa, if he or she is observant at all, goes to Fitzgerald's. Their embalming rooms and so on are considered kosher. They've been specially blessed and treated and so on. So both temple and synagogues members usually use Fitzgerald's. But in Charles's case, the funeral home people are allowed to deal with the body. From B'nai Emunah, they have a special group of people who come and bathe the body, prepare it, dress it, and so on. Yeah. So it's different. So in long ago times, touching a body was considered ritually unclean. Not today. All right. Let's look at verse 22. This is a well-known benediction. I used it last Sunday morning. I just want you to know where it was if you've forgotten. It's in Numbers, chapter 6, verse 22. The I am becoming, who I am becoming, spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, thus you shall bless the Israelites. You shall say to them, The I am becoming who I am becoming, bless you and keep you. We'll use a shortened form. Yahweh, make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh, lift up His countenance upon you and give you shalom. So they shall put my name on the Israelites. I will bless them. You probably know this, that the word benediction that we use comes from Latin. Okay. Bene means good. Dictation, or if you would, or to dictare is to speak. It means raise your hands and say the good words. Raise your hands and say the good words. So every benediction, the last word you hear from your minister ought to be encouraging, helpful, hopeful, good words, not bad words, not frightening words, good words. So benediction means say the good words. And one of those that we use, and certainly the rabbis use, is this one from Numbers. All right, let's look at chapter 10. Yep, we're doing fine. Chapter 10, let's look at verse 12. Just to sort of give you an idea about what's going on here. It's not one of the great stories. Then the Israelites set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai. Wilderness, remember, desert. They set out by stages from the desert of Sinai, and the cloud settled down in the wilderness, the desert of Paran. They set out for the first time at the command of the I am becoming who I am becoming by Moses. Verse 29. Okay, same chapter. So Moses said to Hobab, son of Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law. Now notice that Rabbi Zimmerman called him Jethro. And sometimes in the Scripture he's called Jethro and sometimes he's called Reuel. And I've told you that by the time the stories get written down, after Solomon and his temple, we seem to have two different names for Moses' father-in-law. And rather than choosing one over the other, those who combine J and E put them right together. I mean, they're both here. As same with the Holy Mountain. Is it Horeb? Is it Sinai? Same mountain. Is it Reuel? Is it Jethro? Same person. Okay. And to be sure you understand that, they tell you, Moses' father-in-law. We are setting out for the place of which Yahweh said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will treat you well. To treat somebody well, well-being is shalom. We will do shalom to you. For Yahweh has promised good to Israel. But he, that is the father-in-law, said to him, I will not go. I'll go back to my own land and to my kindred. He said, Moses, now we think is antecedent to this pronoun, Moses said, do not leave us, for you know where we should camp in the wilderness, and you will serve as eyes for us. Remember when Moses got there, after fleeing from Egypt, after murdering an Egyptian, he found an oasis, a watering hole, sat down there, and here came Jethro, or Reuel's daughters, to draw water, and some young toughs were pushing them back, and Moses dealt with the young toughs and helped them water their animals. Remember? So Moses is saying, wait, you know this country better than I do. Help us. Come with us. You will serve as eyes for us. Moreover, if you go with us, whatever good the Lord does for us, the same we will do for you. God has promised us a land of milk and honey. If we get milk and honey, we're going to give some to you. So they set out from the mount of the Lord. It's Sinai. It's Horeb. 3 days' journey with the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, going before them 3 days' journey to seek out a resting place for them, the cloud of the Lord being over them by day when they set out from the camp. Okay, chapter 11. Now when the people complained in the hearing of Yahweh about their misfortunes, Yahweh heard it, and his anger was kindled. Remember, the word for anger means fire in the nose. We know what kindling is. It's the way you start a fire. So when God hears these people whining and complaining, it starts a burning in His nose. And what did Rabbi Zimmerman tell you? It's easier to get the people out of Egypt than to get Egypt out of the people. So they're still holding on to Egypt in their hearts and, of course, making it even better than it really was. Then the fire of Yahweh burned against them. It kindles in the nose, if you would, and is growing hotter and hotter, and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. I mean, when God gets fired up, it's like a dragon's breath, if you would. But the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to Yahweh, and the fire abated. Moses, every once in a while, has to be the mediator between the people and God. So that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned against them. Verse 4, the rabble among them had a strong craving. Who? The rabble. There's some in every congregation. There's one or two in every Sunday school class, As the rabbi said the other night, he was told as a young rabbi, when you go to this new place, there will be some who will love you no matter what, and some who will dislike you no matter what. But the more dangerous group for you is the first, he said. The ones who accept anything and everything you do without question. The Israelites also wept again and said, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic, spices, This manna must have been bad stuff, Manna, gee, some powdery white chalky stuff. Not very palatable. If you just had an onion, a little garlic to go with it. A little onion, a little garlic would have been so nice. But now our strength is dried up. There's nothing at all but this manna to look at. So then the author decides to describe it to later generations who don't know what it was like. Now the manna was like coriander seed. Its color was like the color of gum rosin. The people went around and gathered it, ground it in mills, beat it in mortars, then boiled it in pots, made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell on the camp in the night, the manna would fall with the dew. Now Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, all at the entrances of their tents. With the flap turned back, you can hear them. Then Yahweh became very angry. This kindling in the nose is really burning now. And Moses was displeased. Not happy that God's gotten angry. So Moses said to Yahweh, why have you treated your servant so badly? Here he is caught right in the crossfire. Have I not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all these people? They're not mine. I'm not their father. Did I give birth to them that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a suckling child to the land that you promised on oath to their ancestors? I got to listen to this all the way to Canaan? Where am I to get meat to give to all this people? For they come weeping to me and say, give us meat to eat. I'm not able to carry all this people alone. They're too heavy for me. If this is the way you're going to treat me, Moses says to God, kill me. Put me to death at once. If I found favor in your sight, if you favor me, kill me. Be better than this. Do not let me see my misery. So Yahweh said to Moses, and this is where Rabbi Zimmerman said again, you have to learn to delegate. Poor Moses has more than he can do. So God says to him, gather for me 70 of the elders of Israel. And he said that didn't necessarily mean old, just meant wiser ones, whom you know to be the elders of the people, those to whom they look for leadership, in other words, officers over them. Bring them to the tent of meeting and have them take their place there with you. I will come down and talk with you there. I will take some of the spirit that's on you and put it on them. And they shall bear the burden of the people along with you, so that you will not bear it all by yourself. And say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. Tell them to get ready. For you have wailed in the hearing of Yahweh, saying, if only we had meat to eat, surely it was better for us in Egypt. Therefore Yahweh will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not only 1 day, or 2 days, or 5 days, or 10 days, or 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. You want meat? You're about to have meat. Because you have rejected Yahweh, who is among you, and have wailed before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? Verse 24. So Moses went out and told the people the words of Yahweh, and he gathered 70 elders of the people and placed them all around the tent. Then Yahweh came down in the cloud and spoke to him, and took some of the Spirit that was on him and put it on the 70 elders. And when the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied, but they did not do so again. Okay, a little bit more. Verse 31. Promise delivered. Then a wind went out from the Lord. Now you know this word for wind. Same word. Ruach. Wind, breath, spirit. Same word. God blew across the waters after the great flood, and they began to dry up. God breathed into first humans, and they became nephesh, living beings. So the Ruach went out from Yahweh, and it brought quails from the sea. Migrating birds, you say. And let them fall beside the camp, about a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, about 2 cubits deep on the ground. A cubit was 18 inches. They're up to their armpits in quail, waist high anyway. 3 feet deep, this author says. So the people worked all that day and night and all the next day gathering the quails. The least anyone gathered was 10 homers, bushel baskets. And they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. But while the meat was still between their teeth, that is, they're still chewing, before it was consumed, the anger of Yahweh was kindled against the people. He sees the way they're gathering all this up now. And the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. Remember, He doesn't like for you to question how much He cares for you. From Massa and Meribah, remember a story we read just a couple of weeks ago, when they had no water and questioned whether God cared or not. He said, don't ever do that to me again. Don't ever do that to me again. You should know with all your heart, I care. Okay. Now, while they were at Hazeroth, Miriam and Aaron, Moses' brother, sister, spoke against Moses. Trouble in the family. Because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. For he had indeed married a Cushite woman. You know where Cush is? Ethiopia. That's right. He married a black woman from Africa. Yep. Where the Nile River flows. Now, again, they practiced polygamy. It wasn't that he had another wife besides Jethro's daughter. He's married a Cushite. It doesn't say anything about her being black, but in fact she was Ethiopian. They said, has Yahweh spoken only through Moses? Who are we? Brother and sister. Are we not pretty important also is what they're getting at. Has He not spoken through us also? Why didn't Moses consult with us? Why didn't he talk with us before making this kind of decision? And Yahweh heard it. Now the man Moses was very humble, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth. And suddenly Yahweh said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. Remember, the tent of meeting, the tent of presence, was just outside all the other tents. So the three of them came out. And then Yahweh came down on a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forward. And He said, hear my words. When there are prophets among you, I, Yahweh, make myself known to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. Not so with my servant Moses. He is entrusted with all my house. That is, Moses is not just a prophet. He's much more. With him I speak face to face, clearly, not in riddles, and he beholds the form of Yahweh. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. He's saying, I don't need this within this family. Now you button it up. Moses is my man, and he's doing fine. He's doing fine. And you leave him alone and get on the right side here. That's all we got time for. We're going to put down Numbers chapter 13 here for next week. That'll be March the 7th. Don't rush off if you haven't been to church. We have handbells and all sorts of things.